Hello, hello. How are we doing today? So, today I want to talk about synergy. It's a concept we hear in Magic all the time, but what does it mean? Well, Merriam-Webster defines synergy as... I'm just kidding. We all know synergy is when cards work well together. I want to dive a little deeper though. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about a couple of different kinds of synergy. There's our more traditional deck-based synergy. Prowess dudes want spells, graveyard decks want things that put them in the yard or work with the yard. You know, your aggro cards in the aggro deck. Don't put Serum Visionary in your aggro deck. Put it in your slower controlling deck. You want Mana War, that tempo creature, to be able to leverage offense. You know, they're both 3-mana 2/2s, but one of them plays to the board, the other one doesn't. So put your more aggressive cards in your aggressive deck. What I've been more interested in lately is what a member of our Discord calls pocket synergy. Pocket synergy is small ball. It's not this top to bottom whole deck synergy. It's when a few cards interact really favorably with one another. And I find these really fun to draft since they don't give you a big overarching goal, but rather look for ways to enable something powerful in your deck with other cards that play well. These smaller build-around goals offer a lot of draft replayability and enjoyment since they aren't usually as committal as these bigger synergies of my deck does the thing. When you put Rise from the Tides in your deck, you really want as many of the cards as possible to either add to the number of zombies you're making or be another spell's payoff. These pocket synergy cards, though, require smaller packages of cards and play well with cards that maybe aren't directly synergistic with them. These are more of a how do I make my card do the thing rather than my deck does the thing. So I'm going to spend some time highlighting and discussing some of my thoughts on Cube in a shorter form than the Jank Tank podcast and focus more on specific cards and more of that MTG nitty gritty. We try to keep the Jank Tank high level, but here I'm going to be focusing on card by card evaluation. I'm going to focus on Peasant in this video since we spend a lot of time on the Jank Tank discussing our main cube, and the Peasant has a lot of defined archetypes, so finding these cool side quests is extremely enjoyable to get away from just building your deck around Rise from the Tides or Spider Spawning for the 13th time. I do want to specify of those cards. I'm not really going to talk about them because they give you clear game plans for what your deck's supposed to do, and that's not really what I'm interested in. First up, I want to talk about Heartfire Hero. It's one of the sweetest synergy cards we've seen in a while. The floor's pretty low as a 1-mana 1/1, but a single trigger makes it one of the best 1-drops in the cube, and after 2 triggers, this is a legitimate threat and probably the best 1-drop in the entire cube. We aren't quite doing constructed wombo combos, though I'll get to that in a bit. They do exist. It's not particularly hard, though, to make this card awesome. Equipment's going to be your most reliable way inside red to trigger this, and they benefit by giving you a permanent stat buff. White and green both have a lot of support for the card. White provides a number of repeatable ways to get stats onto the mouse, while green is better at making the mouse large in a single go or taking advantage of its size with trample and card draw. Outside of those three, I do think this is more of a Naya card, but blue and black provide very little in the way of direct support, but black can recur or protect the rat from being exiled, while blue can protect it in general or provide a tempo card like Out Cold to get blockers tapped so that you can take advantage of your giant creature. I do also need to mention we do run cards like Monstrous Rage and Legion Leadership that go completely wild with the mouse, and also Improvised Club is a great way to dome someone for 8 or more, and if you're feeling really, really feisty, you could try something like Repulsive Mutation for some nonsense. Do remember, Valiant can be triggered by any target effect, so sometimes your own effect could do this. You know, opponent tapped out with no blockers, On-Card Crasher can exert to give the mouse +1/+1. It won't come up often, but remember, these little edges add up over time. Lively Dirge is one of the more interesting pieces of reanimation we've seen in a while. It's got multiple cool levels of upside, being able to recur multiple creatures and letting you entomb to tutor for a target. It's a bit expensive, but I find the card genuinely powerful, as well as more interesting than other options. Inside black, there's a ton of internal synergy, recurring something like a Fellstinger, and then a 1-drop to sacrifice a solid turn. Black also has multiple recursive creatures we can dump into the yard with an entomb effect. And Blood Artist effects work really well with the card since you can dump an extra creature into play, getting around how awkward those effects can be to play on curve. Marionette Apprentice isn't an exception. That card's just generally very good. And we really can't talk about the card without mentioning Archfiend's Vessel. The card's very good in general, but Dirge's ability to tutor and recur the card alongside another 3-drop is exceptionally broken. White generally provides the most support by design. White-black is a mid-range reanimator deck, so there's a number of these targets. Stuff like Guardian of the Great Door, our new patched Plaything, Breathless Night, etc. represent a ton of stats for the cost. Being able to recur Ruthless Lawbringer and a 1-drop to sack is that classic OTJ grind combo that I think you should be looking for in your lively dirge decks if you're touching white. In general, white just has a lot of creatures that are low on the curve, and being able to get around some of these restrictions these cards have with this card is really powerful. Green provides even more recursion and toolboxing, with green-black being a premier deck in the cube. I think Dirge is a little bit weaker here as a card, since many of Green's best cards are more expensive threats, and something like Blood for Bones often makes more sense, but I still think there's quite a lot to be doing here. Rutstein and a 1-drop while dumping the best target in your deck to buy back with the Rutstein is still a pretty good line. So red can absolutely play Dirge, but I think for red-black, it's going to be the black cards doing a lot of the heavy lifting, getting your Blood Artist or your Sack Outlet into play. That being said, Cunning Coyote sticks out since the recurring it and hasting out other creature can enable good attacks, kind of like a mini push-pull. Additionally, if you're dumping cards in the yard, Scrapwork Mutt makes a lot of sense since you can sit it there and then recur it on a future turn to enable a big attack. And finally, Begarden Dragonheart sticks out as a tutorable red sack outlet that also represents instant damage the black-red deck's interested in. Blue doesn't provide very much to the reanimation plan. Most of Blue's creatures are timing specific or very deck contextual. That being said, there's a number of looters in blue that can help set up the Dirge, and something like Shoreline Looter is quite good to hit. Additionally, there's Captive Weird, which is a pretty reasonable thing to buy back for 1 mana. It's no Archfiend's Vessel, but it's going to be bigger than a lot of other 1 mana cards you could get on the following turn. Remember, if you have Dirge in your deck, prioritize the cheap removal creatures for targets. We have a couple of them across the cube. And also remember that Entomb isn't only creatures, so flashback spells can be good targets as well. Emrakul's Messenger has been one of the sweeter cards from MH3, making a splash even in the JDG mainline cube. The card has a number of powerful synergies available to it. Staying in blue, we have a variety of ways to trigger it, and generally permanents that can do this multiple times are going to be better enablers than your one-shot spells, but both can be valuable. There's not a lot of interesting things to do with the tokens here beyond extra blockers or mana for some expensive blue spells, and we don't really have a Time Warp or Sublime to ramp into since Rise from the Tides isn't the kind of card you want to turbo out. Black ends up being a very common pair for this. In the main cube, we have Yawgmoth to really take advantage of the Messenger, and while we don't run them, Skullport Merchant and Dockside Chef can do a similar job, and we do run Ecstatic Awakener and Fellstinger that can do this as well. Eviscerator's Insight is an obvious combo piece since it was in Modern Horizons 3 and all. And we only need to trigger the Messenger once, and then every insight pays for its own future fuel. Finally, we need to mention that Messenger plays well with Intimidation Campaign because we can curve them into one another, the Messenger into the campaign, and the tokens give us either blockers to buy us time or mana to use the campaign more often. Red might actually be the best color to pair with Messenger. In addition to the number of rummagers you get to trigger it, the tokens can help with racing by blocking or helping you play all the cards you'll have access to in your blue-red deck, since that deck tends to play a lot of cards each turn. Additionally, I also want to mention Begarden Dragonheart again here as a way to turn your tokens into damage. White and green provide a bit less value here. They don't really do the things the Messenger is looking for, though going wide in white with Dorks can be useful, and Peregrine Took makes it a passable combo piece. Last thing I do want to mention is that the Invasion plays really well as well with Invasion of Amonkhet, since you can curve into them to trigger it and then immediately start attacking it down. And obviously fellow Modern Horizons 3 card Mindless Conscription can play well in a deck that wants Messenger as well, even if it's a bit harder to trigger since you need to draw 3 cards in a turn. Shadowfax is one of the wildest cards in the Peasant Cube. It's a powerful combo piece that leads to some absolutely massive blowouts. Any creature with a higher mana cost and 3 or less power is on the table as an option. And Combat Thresher is basically the combo piece for Shadowfax. It's the kind of play that just ends games. In addition to being a big double striker, we even get to go up on cards. White has some other decent hits with stuff like Area Auxiliary. Best of these are just flyers that add stats, and there's a few of those. Note also that if you can get Shadowfax to 5 power, you get some more options like Guardian of the Great Door and Patched Plaything you can flip into play. If we go into a third color, we get a few interesting things, but none of them are really as good as the premier white creatures. I think black has the best for cards for Shadowfax, with cards like Hero of the Dunes and Vampire Sovereign are very good cards for your Shadowfax deck. Cloudblazer also exists, and I don't know if there's a deck that wants Cloudblazer and Shadowfax, but you get to put a Muldrifter into play if you do, which is kind of cool for 0 mana. Red provides less obviously exciting options than white, but there's still some decent threats. And then this is another spot where I want to mention that the sack synergy cards kind of line up well if you end up in Mardu. We cut Soul Migration as well, but this is the exact sort of threat that Shadowfax can cheaty face out. This is a card that remains super interesting as we move forward, given that Magic likes to put a lot of interesting designs these days. We're bound to get more expensive-ish creatures that are totally cubable that just happen to go nuts with the Lord of Horses. Bandit's Hall is a card I think people have been sleeping on a bit. The card's great at providing mana and cards. What more do you want? I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this one, but I did want to shout out how it can fit into most non-aggro decks. I think the best thing about it, and perhaps not the most obvious thing to do with Hall, is the sheer amount of creatures we play that also interact. These are huge wins, as the only thing the Hall doesn't actually do is provide you with board presence. These cards add to the board and take away from some of your opponent's resources while getting you cards back in the long run by triggering the Hall, and they exist in different forms across every color in the cube. Obviously, we can also use traditional removal. The upside is they tend to be efficient, but even bigger is they can trigger the Hall on the opponent's turn, meaning we can play a creature on our turn and then a cheap spell on our opponent's turn, so we've built up a card draw in a single turn cycle. All right, people. This is more of a shout out for Bobble, but please draft it. It's good. Even with 0 synergy, playing a 39 card deck is really powerful. And if you have a couple of things to work with it, it's free real estate. Grappling Claw is a new addition to the queue, and I'm going to shout out this card as a 6 synergy, since on turn 3 we can play the Hall and then the Claws and start tagging our opponent's graveyard while we rack up card draw in the back for the Hall. Black-Red doesn't seem like a good home for Hall, and while I generally agree, I do want to mention how good it is at incidentally triggering the Hall, with cards like Makeshift Munition and Mortar Pod alongside recursive creatures and Blood Artist actually targeting. This is something to keep in mind if you pick it up, even if it's just as a sideboard option for grinding. And then a few last things to keep in mind is sometimes crimes can come from weird places. They don't always directly look like cards that commit crimes, but they actually can. And also be careful with the Intimidation campaign. It's good with the Hall since it provides more mana and the Intimidation campaign provides redundancy, but you can also hit do nothing territory if you get too deep. You want to be making sure you're able to actually interact with your opponent's creatures and not get run over. So I think Nesting Ground is probably the weakest of the cards that I've mentioned. While it's a very cool card, I think it can be really difficult to actually break it. That said, it's also a card that can just fit into your mana base as a 17th or 18th land if your mana is good. One of the fairly obvious things with this card is moving +1/+1 counters around. Some cards provide you with a number of these to move around and help you enable attack, and the new patched Plaything offers a new avenue of moving -1/-1 counters off of it onto an opponent creatures, which will make yours larger while weakening theirs. Heartfire Hero again comes up. Move the +1/+1 counter onto it, and suddenly you have at least a 3/3 hero. I also think one of the best things you can do with this card probably involves sagas. I don't think reds are going to be game breaking. They can provide some solid value though. Green has some interesting options, with Oozewag giving creatures trample and providing good pressure. Welcome to Sweet Tooth has a couple of levels of synergy. You can pay 2 to keep generating foods, or 1/1s depending on when you play it, and while that's probably not strong enough on its own, it then provides you with some additional +1/+1 counters that you can move around with the Nesting Ground. Finally, one of the best things you can do is move counters onto Evolution Witness in order to rebuy permanents like your sagas. Blue again here is providing a little less, but I do want to mention that Behold the Unspeakable can be quite wild in very grindy matchups. And if you're in more of a tempo game, moving counters onto an evasive creature can be a reliable way to win the game. Black provides a few sources of these +1/+1 counters and also has one of the best targets to put counters on in Deep Cavern Bats. If you're running a saga like the Eldritch Reborn, can also be extremely powerful. And remember, if you move any counter onto an opponent's card, say a lore counter onto their creature, that commits a crime. And finally, I want to shout out some stuff on this that's good that we don't run. Finality counters can be moved onto opponent creatures to exile them and recycle your own card, with Persist offering a similar value play that makes the Nesting Ground stronger. And finally, I think the best saga at Peasant to run with this is the Princess Takes Flight. For 5 mana, it lets you start to kill a creature, and then another next turn, and then we can keep suspending 2 to kill another creature on every subsequent turns, creating sort of an infinite supply of suspend 1 Swords to Plowshares. If instead we want to kill our opponent, we can sit on chapter 2 for a while we hit them with big flying dudes turn after turn. This saga plays well with a number of other powerful white cards, so while we don't play it, the card is a banger. Also, remember, this video is by no means all-encompassing. If you're new to Peasant Cube, I hope this gets you excited to start cooking some. Finding new synergies in Cube is going to help up your game and increase the number of sweet, powerful decks you get to play while also keeping the draft section fun. Be on the lookout for other pockets of synergy next time you're drafting, and thank you for coming to my Teld Talk.